So for the first part of the morning, we had a chance to talk about some of the overview and some of the platform year in review and where we saw some things going. It's really difficult to talk about platforms and not consider the security implications. And we heard a little bit of that from Jess, but I can't think of anyone better sort of positioned to speak to these issues than the next set of panelists. So please join me here on stage. We have Edna Conway, who is the Chief Security Officer for the global value chain for CISCO. We have Jennifer Bisceglie, who's President and CEO of Interos. We have Chris Krebs, Director of the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And we have Karl Wagner, founder and CEO of Eastern Sky Technologies, and more recently, head of security for Tesla and a longtime CIA officer. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Edna, but please give this panel a welcome.
So thanks so much. We're really delighted to be here, but before we begin, I have to embarrass Jeff for a moment, because this is how this turned out. I had the privilege of being with Jeff up at Dartmouth a while ago, and he said, hey, would you like to come sit on a panel? And I said, sure. And then it turned into, can you help me get some panelists? And then 2 weeks ago was, I'm not really going to facilitate. Can you facilitate and speak? So bear with me. I learned I was facilitating about 48 hours ago. So thank you all so much for joining me. I want to talk to you a little bit about something that we heard this morning, really, which is this concept, really, of what I call public-private partnership, that we're seeing regulatory guidance. I think it was Marshall who was sitting here talking about the fact that you referenced he happened to be on a plane with a political candidate, and it would be really great if those of us who have some industrial or academic experience can partner with our regulators. And I think security's sort of been on the forefront of everybody's mind for quite some time. But what I'm seeing is, with the explosion of the connections that we're all making, the reality is folks are starting to notice that the third-party ecosystem is something that we all need to be aware of. And the reality is, with every connection that we make, what we're doing is expanding that ecosystem exponentially. And while the reticence to say something to folks who are just thinking about it, like, where have you been? Only God made something from nothing. The rest of us have bloody supply chains. I keep that usually to myself and think out loud with folks like this about really where we're going. And what I've deployed is a sort of layered approach, an architecture that looks, from my perspective, at three fundamental risks. So I worry about manipulation, I worry about espionage, and I worry about disruption. And it doesn't matter to me what the platform modality is. Those are the risks that we're worrying about. And I think each of the members of this panel have a very different but related perspective on that. This is going to be interesting, because this is over here, and I need to look at them, so bear with me for a minute. And Jennifer, I think I really want to start with you, to be honest with you. I mean, I think, we've known each other, and I've watched the growth of, quite frankly, a fantastic AI-enabled, innovative platform that you have. But talk a little bit about, as we see this exponential growth of the third-party ecosystem, what are the tools and the processes that we can leverage to make it far less daunting and actually give ourselves greater visibility than we have ever had before, and understand our risks with a greater degree of depth and precision?
Great, thank you, Edna, and I appreciate being here. And I think, just listening to the panelists this morning and then your introduction, it's really interesting, because to your point, there seems to be an awakening and an awareness that it's not just who you're directly connected to, but who they're connected to as well. And so my company's 15 years old, and we've actually been going through this growth with the market. And having been in a background where we helped multiple US multinationals offshore their manufacturing, and then that organization would outsource, and that organization outsource, and it got to the point, when we became a global economy back in the 90s, that the big push, I guess, that we really have no idea who's touching our stuff. But I also think, and again, from your intro and the conversations this morning, is that leveraging artificial intelligence and some of the technologies out there, when you talk about layering, it's making sure that you understand and identify what the true vulnerability or risk is, and you have a commensurate response. And I think that's what we're seeing. And so our platform actually visualizes global sub-tier relationships for exactly that reason. If it's somebody's coming at you and it's a digital relationship, like it's a cloud provider, it's not the same reaction or vulnerability or threat that they pose to you that's somebody that's making a widget. And so that's what we're seeing, is that folks are coming to us to help them understand globally who they're connected to. One is from a protection security opportunity, but the other is, if you think about it, it was talked about this morning, between just technology advancements, 5G, IoT, we are so hyper connected to each other, we have no idea who we're connected to globally. And so part of it is interruption, like you're talking about. Part of it's, so some of it's malicious and some of it's unintended, but you can be interrupted or impacted from people you don't even know that you're connected to.
Great, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Chris, let me turn to you. I mean, you and I have talked about the reality that, quite frankly, trying to secure what may be one of the largest enterprises on the planet, the US government, in a world where, quite frankly, the connection with the private sector is now pervasive, is an interesting challenge. And what I really wanted to talk to you about is, given that intertwined nature, right? How is the newest organization underneath the Department of Homeland Security dealing with that? You've done some really sort of interesting things. What are the fundamentals that you're driving, and what do you think we really need to approach? And I love your approach, which is, how do we do it together?
So you, in your opening comments, you mentioned the word regulation a couple times, and I'm just sitting here screaming in my brain. My agency, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, we like security so much, we have it in our name twice. We are the federal civilian lead for cybersecurity, critical infrastructure protection. When you kind of really pull it all together, what it really means is, whether it's cyber, whether it's physical, whether it's supply chain, insider threat, we're the risk management agency. But more importantly, what we see ourselves as is the nation's risk advisor. And I'm using these words pretty carefully here. I'm saying advisor, I'm not saying that we're the nation's risk manager, because when it comes down to it, at the literal end of the day, I'm not pushing buttons on someone's behalf. They're the ones doing it. My job is to provide something of unique value to them to enable them to manage their own risk better. Our authorities are based in the Homeland Security Act of 2003, when the department was established as essentially a counterterrorism organization. Cybersecurity was actually a kind of afterthought in terms of establishing it was an afterthought being baked into the legislation. In fact, a piece came down from the National Security Agency and the Department of Defense. It was a really small piece. But over that 15-year intervening period, we went from a very small shop to a very large shop in terms of budget and people and capabilities. But really, at its essence, just like on the physical side and the cyber side, our authorities are public-private partnership-based, which is an overused term in Washington, D.C., but really what it ends up being is, I have to engage on a regular basis with our private sector partners, our federal government partners, our state and local government partners, to understand what the delta is, what they are not able to do for themselves, whether it's a market failure, a resource constraint, whatever it is, and then I have to be able to provide something from the government, whether it's derived from intelligence or some other sort of at-scale leveraged piece. Greatest example, I think, right now is our work in election security. So 2016, I don't think there was a person in the federal government that was really thinking about forward-leaning into state and local governments, providing them security assistance to help beat back the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, whatever. In this 2.5, 3 year period since then, we have flooded out in the zone and provided intelligence through security clearances and briefings, actual technical support and capabilities, vulnerability management, risk and vulnerability assessments, pen tests, hunt, incident response. And then we've pulled together a community of practice on election security with all 50 states and pushing 2,000 local election jurisdictions. It's just the way we have to work. We have to provide something of value. We have to incentivize. If we had regulated elections, the equipment, the approach, the mandates in 2016, we would have immediately been sued by every state in the union. We would be still digging out of that backlog. Instead, we had to get to brass tacks really early on, figure out what they needed, and then provide something of value.
Yeah, so it's a really great point. So it's really cool that I sent you all notes on what I was going to ask. That's gone now. So let's think for a minute about what you just said, because I think we have a unique advantage in the United States because we have something called NIST, which is not a regulatory body, but combines best of breed in operational processes, in technological innovation, and methodologies. And we live in a world where, all of us have talked about this, even when we just had our brief call, the convergence of information technology and operational technology. I'm not sure people understand yet the full ramifications of that. We've been talking about it. There's been a lot of slideware about it. I figure we're probably up to about now, last calculation I did, I thought we were at 56. I think we're probably about 63% there. And that's in the cutting edge side. So when you think of some of the industry best practitioners on the OT side. Karl, I have a question really for you when I begin to think about this. Operational technology brings to bear this whole other unique spectrum, right? When I talk to all of my colleagues and the team about information technology, we have the ability to use role-based access control. We have the ability to use IT in a way that is not perfect, but can detect anomalies in a way that is prescribed. Now add IT on top of OT and what that OT functionality is. And you have a deep and rich background, not only in counterintelligence, but we talked about insider threat.
Right.
How do we, as we're living in this world where we're now hyper-connected, not just in the way we work, live, play, and learn, but the way in which we experience the very core functionality that governments provide to its citizens to live? How do we bring to bear an awareness, and what tools do we have on insider threat that we haven't necessarily been thinking about before?
Right. Okay. Thanks. Let me just say, first of all, my worldview on this is informed by 29 years at CIA. I bought the Bible, which is Jeff's book, earlier, so that if I have questions, I can refer to that or go back to you all if I can't answer them. But so you all know what my background is. Last job was Chief of Counterintelligence Operations. We had an insider threat, CISCO, which is the regulatory body that looks at mergers and acquisitions of U.S. entities by foreign entities, et cetera. And then I transitioned to the private sector and have a global due diligence company that does risk advisory work as well as insider threat consulting. In between there, I worked at Tesla as a global security director. So I think the key word for me so far has been layered approach. Ogres have layers. We know from Shrek that ogres are not bad, they're good. I think that's the only way to do this. I was thinking as we talked about, you're exposing yourself, the more networked we are to a bunch of vulnerabilities that you need to mitigate, threats and vulnerabilities. At the same time, and without speaking too specifically, since I'm still under the secrecy oath, et cetera, but a lot of the stuff is open, in the CIA or in any part of the intelligence community, to the extent that we kept ourselves inside our echo chamber and behind our walls without interacting with the outside world, we're foregoing a ton of opportunity. And so that's opportunity risk, right? And so the layered approach and engaging with private industry is the only way to go. I don't know if later we're going to talk about the engagement, but you mentioned public-private partnerships. We're seeing a huge uptick in that, and thank God. It's long overdue. So now that I'm kind of out in the private sector, one of the roles that I'm trying to fulfill is to be a bridge between the federal government and Silicon Valley, Austin, wherever the industry may be, to help with the cultural translation, to help with the sales cycle is different. The sales cycle is longer. There's There's bureaucracy on both sides. There's enough fault to go around. But the fact is we have to get this right. And then there's the third leg of the tripod, which is academia. I'm starting to see this really build. DHS now has the, I think it's called the Silicon Valley Innovation Program. The CIA has an innovation outpost on the West Coast. DoD has AFWorks, which is the Air Force's incubation cell, SOFWorks, which is special ops, DIU-X, which is now DIU, since it's not experimental anymore. All of these, there's one called MD5, which is now, they changed their name to the National Security Innovation Network, are meant to be the place, and they're all over the country, where academia and industry can engage with government. At the same time, I'm seeing that industry still has, in some places, a bit of a lack of understanding as to how they can engage. And so the engagement is vital. Otherwise, we're closing ourselves off from new capabilities, some of which can actually help us address the threats, right, as we embrace the new technologies. Right? And that's what the cybersecurity industry is all about. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, no, I think it goes close. I think insider threat is still a little bit of a challenge for us when you start to think about operational technology, right? I mean, it's, you know, I hail from the live free or die state, and as technologically savvy as I am, you know, I'm still apt to, you know, when threatened, you know, reach for my SIG 380, right? So there's a physical element to that. And we need to be aware of that. Chris, let me come back to you for a minute, if I can, because we've talked about this convergence area, and I think it's a fantastic area. And I want to talk about something that's going on right now that's a sort of glaring example with the Department of Energy. So it has these wonderful institutes that it stood up, and it speaks, Karl, to what you talked about, including academia. And Jennifer, I know you're aware and have participated in a number of the institutes that already exist. They're looking, but I have this great hope. So you know, for me, look, the glass is always full. It might be, you know, a small portion of a liquid, but there's still air in it, right? The glass is always full. And here I see institute that's focused on manufacturing efficiency and reducing use of power. Fantastic. But the institute also, and they're doing it's out to bid now, right, for a 5-year grant. Don't hold me to how many $1 million it is. I don't recall. I want to say it's $5 million, but it might be more. And what we're looking at is cybersecurity. Why? Because of a recognition by DOE, and quite frankly, those of us who had the privilege of advising them on putting it out to bid, that we live in a platform-based environment. And all of a sudden, when you pull automation in, you're going to get efficiency from a power utilization, but you bring all this security risk in. So for me, what's exciting is IT/OT. You and I often talk about, is it a challenge? Is it an opportunity? Is it both? And I see what the DOE is doing, where they're adding cybersecurity to the build-in of a new institute whose primary function is to render manufacturing more efficient in the US. How do we see more of that? And quite frankly, how are you leveraging what you're doing to enable other agencies to do more of that with your education, knowledge, and availability of information?
So I could go on for hours right now, but I won't. There are a few things that we're doing, but you know, the big kind of, you already touched on it, is a challenge, is an opportunity. It's like, is technology good or bad? Technology is technology. It's what you make of it. So what we're trying to do is put a lot of resources and effort across the interagency, but also with our private sector partners, to understand, get a better level of understanding of really what infrastructure looks like, regardless of sector. One of the things that we've recently launched is a thing called the National Critical Functions Set. We had historically, this is, you know, since the end of the Clinton administration, been looking at a set of national critical infrastructure sectors that at the current time, right now it's at 16 sectors, you know, energy, banking and finance, nuclear power, transportation, water. That's great, artificial buckets across the economy, but it doesn't actually really let us understand what are the critical services and functions that flow out of those sectors. So sitting down with our partners in across the interagency, as well as our partners in industry, from U.S. government, industry, everybody comes together and say, okay, within these sectors, what are the things that really matter? What are the highest level of significance services and functions that, if disrupted, corrupted, degraded, would have a appreciable impact on the national economy, national security, public health, and safety? So we got it down up from 16 to 55 functions. We at one point were looking at like 100, and then we got, anyway, but the point is, it's an evolution, it's really a risk architecture more than anything. It's how to look at the services and functions that the economy and the private sector provide. Much like in the federal government, we have mission essential functions and these things that ensure the continuity of the constitutional government. But most importantly, through this process, what it does is it strips away an organization or an asset or a facility, and it's more about an organization, what are the things that they do for the economy. So if you're talking about a big bank, it's more about wholesale payments and less about the ATM network. It's about the things that make sure the economy keeps ticking and whirring. If you lose an ATM network in a city, guess what? There are ways to get cash into the city. Look at what the financial services folks did in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria when power was knocked out. They literally put pallets of cash on planes and flew it into the island. These things can be managed. Now, what can we do with this? Well, the most important aspect was the fact that the industry, the private sector, told us what they thought was important. This wasn't the government saying, these are the 5 things that we think are most important in your sector. And this goes back to the piece, the importance of engagement. The intelligence community in particular doesn't have a bunch of analysts sitting there that know how wholesale payments work, that know how treasury works, that knows how power generation, how pipelines. That's just not reality. They know how governments work. They know how militaries work. So what we've got to do a better job of in this public-private partnership space to get ahead of any of the convergence-associated risks is have the private sector tell us, here's what we're worried about. Here are the players. Here are the enabling functions, materials, technologies. Yep. And then start painting the picture so we can start defining an intelligence need, push it over to the IC, and they can go, now I know what I'm supposed to be looking for in the defense of American critical infrastructure. We're doing that right now. This is an evolution over the last 6 to 9 months. But we are going to be in a better position a year from now in terms of having an alert and warning process, where if we come across information that the Russian GRU or FSB is targeting a certain company that is, again, in the election process perhaps, if it's a company name, that never would have popped on the radar. Now, because we've defined, we understand what's important, we've pushed that to the IC, they collect against it, now we can loop that back.
I just decided to come back.
Okay.
I'm going back to the CIA.
There you go. There
He's inspired.
So thanks for that. Jennifer, I know you want to comment on that, but I want to direct you for a minute if I can.
Sure.
Because I think there's something parallel, and we talk about this when we talk about public-private partnership is, and you know my architecture very well, that architecture is not only a layered approach of physical, logical, operational, behavioral, and security technology, but it's also this need for exactly what you just articulated, which is flexibility and elasticity that's based on what, for me, that third-party ecosystem does. Your third-party ecosystem's different than mine, but at the end of the day, they're all providing something different. Where I think you have a unique perspective is, I want to deeply understand what they're providing to me, but I also need to understand where they're relying on capacity, functionality, and maybe just plain old-fashioned brain share from third parties. How do we, when we were listening to Jeff and Marshall and our colleague, forgive me for not remembering your name from KPMG, who were talking about platforms and the massive amounts of data, that can be a huge repository of knowledge for somebody like me saying, that's fantastic, I trust you, you're doing a really great job. Oh, you're getting chips from where? That's interesting for me to know. How do we manage that?
I think that's a great question, and actually, summarizes what we just heard. And you actually said a key word, which is trust. And that's what we're seeing, is that whole trust but verify. Because, again, we're so hyper-connected that even your tier one or your third party doesn't understand, unless they look at it this way, what's coming at them either directly or tertiary, right? And so even what Chris just talked on is that conversation that says, this is what I'm providing you, this is what it can do, this is where I'm vulnerable. It's not them. It's 3 hops away from them that I need to be aware of and I need to be watching, if you will. And so what we're seeing is, as you mentioned, from a platform standpoint, so 2 uses of platform. So our platform, we're bringing through that tons of information. I walked past a television with Michael Dell on it not too long ago. And he was talking about that right now from a big data, which we're all hyped up about, we only use and make use of about 5% of what's out there, right? So these tools and the ethics around it and how you use this information still has a long way to go. But what we're seeing is a couple things. If I use this other definition of platform, which is what's being provided, is folks are changing their risk discussion and how they're looking at uninterrupted operations, not from how much I spend with my supplier base or who I'm connected with, but the consequence. And that's really important. That's a huge shift that we're seeing, and it really underpins what you were just talking about. When you start bringing businesses together with industry together, industry is incentivized differently, right? We hear that constantly than the government is. And when you talk about standards, standards are great. I love what NIST does, but now you've also told the bad guys what to not look at, right? And in addition to that, when businesses operate, they're not necessarily looking at the values or the impact to those around them, right? They're trying to make money. So if you think about the gentleman from Barclays that was on before that was talking about, we used to care about this and now we care about this. So when you talk in technology, it's like what enables them to do what they need to do, but creates an awareness of when things are going to happen at a moment's notice, that they have the walls up that they need. And so from what we're seeing, it's that dialogue is really transitioned from not just who am I buying from, but can you flow that down? Can you show me who you're buying from behind that? And that's where we talk about the mapping from before. It's that visualization, because it's not just like a bill of materials that I'm worried about. It's all the relationships around it.
So, Chris, you have a comment. I want to go to Karl, but go ahead.
So once you do that mapping, then you have to have on top of it a rules-based approach on determining trustworthiness. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you've mapped out the spider web of 35 hops down. How do you do this? So in September 2017, we issued a binding operational directive that required the removal of Kaspersky Labs antivirus product, which is a world-leading product. It's a quality product. However, there were significant concerns from a risk management perspective posed to the federal government. We developed a test, looked at 3 critical elements. First is the technical piece. The second's the legal piece. The third is the relationship piece. The technical piece is, what's the thing? What does it do? What does it have access to? Once it hoovers up data, where does it go? How is it updated? Is it remotely updated? What's the quality of the engineering? This series of questions, looking at the analytic piece of the thing. Then you have to step back and say, okay, well, what is the legal regime? This is the legal piece, the legal regime under which that technology is beholden to. What is there meaningful judicial review in that country? Is there a series of laws that would compel access by the intelligence services? And then the third piece is the relationship piece. So the company itself, what is its relationship with its home government? Is it in bed with the intelligence services? Is it staffed and owned and operated by former intelligence that are close? So with Kaspersky, this one was pretty easy, right? It's an AV that has, essentially root level access, scanning across and picking up files. What does a good AV do? Sends it back to a big data capability that's able to compare across a broad range of deployments to look for trends and anomalies. Okay, interesting. Where does that data go? It goes to Moscow. We know there are a series of laws, including the SORM law, that would compel any communications company to allow the FSB to put a monitoring capability within that environment. Oh, that's interesting. So you're telling me that potentially FSB is peering right into the federal civilian agencies. Interesting. That's not cool. So, and then the final piece is Eugene Kaspersky is a former intelligence officer of the Russian military. Okay, I got a problem here. We have untenable risk posture. We were able to apply that methodology, get it pulled out. They sued us. We were victorious in court not once but twice. Congress came on top and passed a law that banned Kaspersky across the entirety of the federal government. And again, it was held up by a court of law after judicial review. So we're pretty confident that this three-tiered approach, this risk framework for analyzing, at least within the federal government, can stand up. And we're stepping back, and we're going to start applying this methodology through the procurement process. So I don't have to pull stuff out after it's deployed, but teamed up with a visibility capability like what Jennifer's talking about, you now have a whole different ability to make risk management decisions as you're going through procurement, as you're going through a risk management approach.
So I think, and I know you want to say something.
Just really quick.
Go ahead.
So to
I picked these people for this panel.
your
I can't get them to be quiet.
To your point,
You knew what you were getting into.
I did.
Another example, right, is that the government is really focused on where's China in our supply chain, right? But to your point, you have to understand what that threat or what that risk is. What does that really open me to? Because oh my goodness, when you started us, some stuff, that's the only place it's made. So of course it's in our supply chain, but it's really looking at, from a platform standpoint, how could that impact me? How much is it going to impact me? And what else do I have in place to protect me? And if it's a problem, you stop using it. Or you figure out other ways to mitigate that within your own. But I think that's a really great point, because visibility is one thing, but unless you do what you just outlined, you can't do this layered approach that you're talking about.
So you gave me a way to get to right where I wanted to go for a couple of minutes, which is, I've been on a kick for probably the last 25 years that we need to change the way we report security. And no disrespect to the wonderful CISOs out there, including ours, who think about, vulnerability detection and time to mitigate. Those are really great things. I think about what you think about, which is I'm worried about the commitment to the enterprises that comprise our customers using our offers in any manner. That's a very different commitment. That means what I have to have against my architecture with its three threats are what I call tolerance levels. And so what I wanted to talk to you about a little bit, Karl, is people are starting to come around to it. I've seen some of the big consulting houses now telling me they have methodologies to translate tolerance levels into dollar risk, because when I go to the board, I want to look at them and say, I have an established tolerance level for each of my third-party ecosystem providers. They're at it or they're not at it. And even if they're at it, let me say it again, it's an established risk tolerance level. That means it's not all security all the time, everywhere. Why? Can't do it, right? And I can't always wait for you, because you're constrained in a way that I'm not. You have a whole set of, thank God we live in a democracy, governmental obligations that are imposed on you, right? I mean, I knew, as did many of us, about Kaspersky long before the binding directive came out, right?
To tie those things together, really, you've mentioned three things now that really resonate. We talk about, I mentioned Russia, you mentioned China, and then you mentioned democracy. What we're seeing is a rise in autocratic states that are weaponizing their tech sector, that are below kinetic warfare, are using hybrid threats to achieve national objectives. And so ultimately what we're talking about here is truly protecting democracy. It manifests in elections, but it's also manifesting in these supply chain conversations. 5G is going to be the greatest next test in how we are doing the things we need to do to protect democracy.
I agree with you. I look at it through, my commitment to the customers, right? I mean, Barclays is a customer. I suspect many enterprises, if there are in the room, are customers. How do I want to protect their success? Because at the end of the day, their success equals the continued growth and sustainment of where they operate. But let me get to you, Karl, because I had to fight them to do it, but I'm getting there.
I can throw in a couple of comments on that right there.
I want to talk a little bit about this concept of tolerance levels, because I've been out there talking about it for a while. It's slowly gaining adoption. Sometimes it's really good to be about 5 to 7 years ahead of everybody. When you're 25 years ahead, it's really, you get some really interesting looks and comments. And you have to be resilient in and of yourself to sustain the course. It's coming around. But how do we leverage the concepts that you came across in counterintelligence to pool what you might provide me, information sharing that we might be doing in a public-private partnership, right, which we're talking about not just with you on the task force, thank you again for putting me on the executive committee, but also in ESF and the operating committee, and what I'm doing with a whole host of European nations. That's great, but how do we blend it together, Karl, into meaningful tolerance levels that allow us to achieve the mission with reality in mind?
Right. Well, I guess I would say first, CIA operations officers are nothing if not practical, right? You have a job to get done. And so what you end up becoming is an expert on risk. Risk versus gain. How much risk are we putting out there in terms of what we're showing to the opposition if they were to discover what we're doing in terms of the physical risk? And some of these can result in people dying. And then what is there to gain? And that kind of critical thinking then permeates your work as you rise up through the organization, and hopefully that's the kind of critical thinking that we're using strategically. I want to use continuous evaluation as an example. I think some of you may have read, and I'll just do this briefly, that the security clearance process is unsustainable the way we've been doing it in the past. You knock on somebody's door who lives next to the person they're investigating, and you ask them, do you know this person? No, never saw him in my life. Why? Because everyone's on their platforms. Nothing wrong with that. That's great. We're connecting in different ways. Meanwhile, the person had a DUI, right? That's available down at the courthouse. But does that come into the discussion? No. So continuous evaluation is a concept that instead of doing things the old gumshoe way, why don't we create a platform of platforms, bringing in the data that's publicly available, maybe some of it that's not. It is a government with special authorities, so that you can more efficiently do security clearance decisions, and you can clear out a bunch of people who should not get any attention and have the thing operate efficiently, right? The reason why I like that as an example and then leading into insider threat is because at the end of the day for me, and maybe it's because I was a human intelligence operations guy for all those years, it's about the people. The technology is really important. That's why we're all here. But what does it do to our society? So from the macro back down to the micro, we're talking about Russia and China. I like Russia and China as business partners in many different contexts. Tesla wouldn't survive. I don't think it will survive unless it can crack the China market, and I'm confident it will. And I won't say much more because I'm not there anymore, but incredible technology. It cannot be done without China. They're partners. At the same time, in the same way you don't even give your best friend all your here's all my medical records, take all my bank account information, you're still my best friend. No, there are levels of transparency, and so Tesla's not going to open the doors to every last person to put that information out there. In the same way then, going down a layer, it's about the people, right? And so insider threat, what's the oldest sensor system out there? Before all of this technology, it's human interactions, right? And there's a shooting down at the post office. Often is, and it's not always, there was a recent case where it wasn't this way. Someone did report this person's having problems. That somebody says, we knew that Joe from accounting was kind of getting a little bit crazy, and we all kind of wanted to say something, but we didn't want to violate his privacy. Well, my concept is not insider threat, but insider trust, right? And that's what we have to. We have to put now an additional layer on top because we're more sophisticated technologically now. We can do another layer that's more sophisticated, kind of socially and culturally aware, where we engage each other earlier on before these threats happen. So adding that in as a sensor, bringing all the existing sensors together to help us. They're not just threats, they're opportunities to have a whole person view of the person or the target that we're looking at. Yep. That's really the only way that this is going to work. Yeah, no, just one final point. It's about values. So again, I like Russia and China as business partners. Do we want them dictating every one of the values that the international system is going to be operating under? I don't think so. This is an international discussion. It should be, right? And so we need to engage in that and to push back to the extent that the way the technology is engineered gives them the advantage and the ability to dictate the cultural values of our international system.
Yeah, it's a great observation. I like insider trust. I may use that.
I did trademark it, so you might have to give me a nickel when you say it.
Okay.
I'll let you use it.
Thank you. That's all been documented now, so I mean. So one thing, we do have some questions, and we have a few minutes for it, but Jeff, I just thought of something is a topic for us to consider for the future, because, you know, I'm always thinking it's a dangerous thing, right? Security, trust, and ethics in a platform-driven world would be an interesting conversation. You were going to read some questions?
We do have a couple of questions. The one with the most votes is more about Chris's hosiery than anything else. Are those government-issued socks?
I'm on enough of these things. I figure I might as well have a little flair.
You talked a little bit about 5G. How real do you see the threat of quantum computing in the platform security space is one question.
Well, we've got the 5G panel next, so obviously let them talk about it. You know, anytime you have the ability to accelerate your compute power, you know, you're able to up your game. And, you know, it is definitely something that we're considering, not considering, but looking at within the agency. But I got to tell you, for me, those are light years away problems. So if anybody in the room has read The Cuckoo's Egg by Cliff Stoll, you know about some of the issues that were happening in the 1980s with foreign actors penetrating, exfilling data. I read that book for the second or third time again in the spring, and I was like, oh my God, we're still dealing with these exact same problems. You know, people just basic cyber hygiene. That is my bread and butter right now is within the agency. It's getting people to secure their platforms. Ransomware, great example. It's not going anywhere. It's going to increase. State and local governments are in a really bad spot. Legacy technology, new technology that they're installing and deploying without the proper strategies and architectures. This is a big problem that will continue for a long time, and it is just really hard to get the basics put in place. And really where we're thinking it all begins with the appropriate governance. It's really a governance issue.
The technologist in me compels me to answer that one, which is it was a very interesting question combining quantum and 5G. I have a very different view, which is we had better get quantum right, period. No ifs, ands, or buts, the hell with 5G. We have to get quantum right as a world and perhaps as a nation. Quantum is the next big risk. So you're right, I agree with you, it's a faraway problem and we do need to get hygiene. Yeah. But there are academicians and a number of us who are very worried about quantum and looking at it and its capacity. 5G will just accelerate the speed at which we can facilitate data infusion and transfer. But quantum is an independent and realistic threat unless we get it right.
Well said. Yes or no question for Chris and Karl. Is there a way through process, policy, or structure to make foreign companies like Kaspersky safe enough to use?
Yes, it's possible. I mean, it all goes back to trust. It goes back to transparency. It's back to rule of law. It goes back to values. There are processes that we can put in place. I don't care where you're from. My approach, my methodology is company and country agnostic. It's an evaluation process. It's based on actions, not words. So don't tell me that you're investing $2 billion into improving the software engineering of your product. Show me, demonstrate. The Huawei Oversight Review Board report that the Brits issued a couple months ago was, to me, one of the most damning pieces of reporting I've read in a long time. Why? Because it showed that there had been zero improvement of the security and software engineering of Huawei kit in a 10-year period, despite the UK saying, you have to improve this, you have to improve this. Nothing had been done. They said $2 billion into a security improvement program. Nothing has been done. So again, actions speak louder than words. Yes, there are processes that you can put in place, but you've got to demonstrate it.
That's Chris Krebs on a yes or no question.
All right.
I'd say yes as well, and I think the new bolstering of the CFIUS Regulatory regime is one example as to a mechanism that can help. Export controls as well are evolving, and then this new partnership between the intelligence community and the whole national security and federal government infrastructure and private, that partnership is a key part of it as well.
Awesome, thank you. Edna, Jennifer, Christopher, and Karl, thanks very much for a great panel. Appreciate it very much.
Having us.
Thank you.